William reached out first, offering his hand to Kate as she gathered the flowing train of her gown. She stepped into the carriage gracefully, her every motion dignified yet tender, as if reminding herself to remain both queen and mother. William followed, his posture tall, his jaw set with quiet determination. Behind them, George, Charlotte, and Louis were led to their own carriage, a smaller but equally ornate vehicle once used by generations of young royals. George slid into his seat with the poise of a future king, while Charlotte, unable to contain her excitement, waved enthusiastically to the staff and guards lined up outside. Louis clutched his tall horse tightly, his wide eyes darting between the crowd and his siblings. As the royal procession began to move, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against cobblestones echoed like a drumbeat announcing history. The carriages rolled out through the palace gates, greeted instantly by a roar from awaiting crowds. Flags waved, voices lifted. Generations of spectators had gathered. Some had camped overnight just to witness this fleeting moment. From the carriage window, William looked out at the sea of red, white, and blue. For a brief second, his gaze softened. He wasn't just looking at subjects, he was looking at the people he would now serve. The journey to Westminster Abbey had begun. The carriages moved at a measured, almost regal pace through the streets of London. Every turn revealed waves of people, families waving Union Jacks, children perched on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples clutching hands as though they had waited their whole lives for this moment. The city had dressed itself for history. Bunting stretched across balconies, flags hung from every window, and church bells rang in jubilation. Inside the carriage, Kate noticed a frail woman in the crowd holding a handwritten sign, "God bless our new king and queen." Her eyes glistened as she waved a small flag with trembling hands. Kate, moved by the sincerity of it, lifted her gloved hand in acknowledgment. A ripple of cheers followed instantly. It was a fleeting exchange, yet one that spoke volumes about the monarchy's bond with the people, an invisible thread of tradition and trust woven across generations. William, ever observant, studied the faces in the crowd. He saw laughter, tears, and snapshots of lives touched by this moment. For him, the realization was sobering. Each cheer wasn't just for crown. It was for the responsibility he now carried, to embody stability, service, and hope. In the children's carriage, Charlotte pressed her nose against the glass, her eyes wide at the endless sea of flags. George, more composed, leaned in close, pointing out familiar landmarks, the Houses of Parliament, Trafalgar Square, already practicing the duty of a future monarch. To know, to explain, to remember. Little Louis tapped his toy horse on the window ledge, creating his own rhythm against the thunder of hooves outside. The music of military bands swelled as they neared Westminster. Brass instruments gleamed, their notes cutting crisply through the London air, lending the moment a near-mythical atmosphere. And then, in the distance, rising above the cheering crowds, the centuries-old towers of Westminster Abbey came into view. For nearly 1,000 years, kings and queens had been crowned within those walls. Today, it would be William and Kate's turn. The stage was set. The morning air in London shimmered with anticipation, but inside Kensington Palace, the scene was far more intimate. Prince William adjusted his uniform one last time, his reflection heavy with the weight of destiny. Beside him, Kate appeared, radiant in silk and diamonds once worn by a queen, while their children, wide-eyed with excitement, prepared for a day they would never forget. This wasn't just history unfolding. It was a family stepping into the heart of a 1,000-year tradition. Before we step into Westminster Abbey and witness the coronation through their eyes, take a moment to join our community here. If you love stories that blend history, emotion, and the human side of royalty, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more heartfelt royal moments, and share it with someone who cherishes these timeless stories. Your support helps keep these journeys alive. The day began not with fanfare, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that carries weight. The calm before a tide of history. In Kensington Palace, golden sunlight spilled through tall windows, casting a warm glow on the polished floors where generations of royals had walked. Prince William stood before an ornate mirror, his ceremonial uniform fitting him like armor, both beautiful and heavy. The The navy fabric shimmered with gold braiding, medals pinned across his chest, a reminder of the centuries of tradition he was about to inherit. He adjusted the last button, and for just a heartbeat, his hand trembled. It wasn't fear. It was the enormity of stepping into a role shaped long before he was born. Then came Kate. She stepped softly into the room, her gown trailing like a whisper of history. Crafted from ivory silk, embroidered with delicate patterns representing the Commonwealth nations, the dress wasn't just fashion. It was symbolism stitched into fabric. A diamond tiara, once worn by Queen Elizabeth II, crowned her elegant updo. William turned, and for a fleeting moment, all the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. "You look radiant," he murmured, reaching for her gloved hand. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was something the cameras would never capture. Two people who were not only husband and wife, but partners about to walk into destiny side by side. In the nursery wing, their children were having their own coronation morning. Prince George stood tall in a miniature uniform, his expression serious beyond his years. Princess Charlotte twirled in her pale pink dress, its embroidered roses and butterflies catching the light with each spin. And little Louis, restless yet curious, clutched a toy horse, his suit almost too grown up for his small frame. It was a royal morning, yes, but above all, it was a family's morning that I and the grand foyer of Kensington Palace. The echoes of polished shoes and hushed whispers filled the air. Palace staff moved with quiet precision, making final adjustments to uniforms and gowns, while photographers discreetly captured moments that would one day become history. Yet amid the grandeur, what stood out most were the small, human gestures. William knelt down to eye level with his children, his voice steady but warm. "Remember," he told them, "today is about showing the world who we are, not just what we wear." His words carried both the authority of a father and the tenderness of a man who understood the weight of legacy. Kate leaned gently over George, smoothing a strand of hair that refused to stay down, before brushing invisible creases from Charlotte's dress. Charlotte reached upward, her small hand brushing against her mother's tiara, her eyes sparkling with innocent wonder. For just a moment, the Queen Consort-to-be was simply a mother, sharing magic with her daughter. Even Louis, restless in his tiny suit, found reassurance in clutching his toy horse. His pocket square had been folded to perfection, his shoes polished until they reflected the chandelier light. Yet his wide-eyed curiosity reminded everyone watching that he was still just a child, navigating a day far bigger than himself. The sound of wheels crunching on the gravel outside signaled the arrival of the carriages. Tension mingled with anticipation. Security teams slid into position. Footmen and attendants adjusted gloves and capes. The palace doors stood ready to open onto history. William straightened, taking Kate's hand once more. He drew in a deep breath, glanced at his reflection in the great gilded mirror, and seemed to silently remind himself, "This is a moment I was born for." The family, bound together in love and duty, stepped forward. The first chapter of their coronation journey was about to begin. The palace doors swung open, and with them a wave of sound and light poured in. Outside, the golden state carriage gleamed in the morning sun, its gold leaf and crystal windows shining like something out of legend. For centuries, it had carried monarchs to their destinies, and now it waited for William and Kate. The air buzzed with anticipation as 8 white horses poured the ground, their bridles polished until they shimmered. Footmen in scarlet uniforms stood at attention, every movement rehearsed until flawless. It wasn't just ceremony, it was theater on the grandest scale, and the world was watching. The carriages rolled steadily onward, and with each passing street, the sense of anticipation deepened. London had not looked this alive in decades. From shop windows to lampposts, the Union Jack waved proudly, turning the city into a living canvas of red, white, and blue. The people who lined the route weren't just spectators. They were participants, adding their voices to the grand chorus of history. Trafalgar Square came into view, and with it, the crowd swelled to a thunderous pitch. Street performers, who had entertained waiting families for hours, paused their act to watch the golden carriages glide past. Even the great stone lions seemed to stand taller, as though keeping solemn guard over the future king and queen. Inside their carriage, William and Kate sat side by side, their posture perfectly regal yet softened by private glances. For William, every face in the crowd carried meaning. He saw children sitting on their father's shoulders, teenagers leaning over barricades with phones in hand, grandparents standing arm in arm. Each represented the generations he now vowed to serve. Kate's eyes caught details a camera's might miss. A young girl dressed in her own handmade crown, a father hoisting his son to get a better view, tears of joy streaming down strangers' faces. These glimpses reminded her of the monarchy's quiet power, its ability to unite a nation not through command, but through shared emotion. Behind them, in the children's carriage, Charlotte was nearly bouncing out of her seat. Her royal wave had already become second nature, and she sent it eagerly toward the crowds, much to their delight. George, more serious, adjusted his uniform jacket and reminded his sister in hushed tones to sit tall, though even he couldn't resist a small, proud smile. Louis clapped each time the crowd erupted, as though convinced the cheers were just for him. Above, on rooftops, security teams kept vigilant watch, their presence invisible to most but vital to the day's safety. The balance between spectacle and security was delicate, yet perfectly orchestrated. And still, the carriages pressed on, closer now to the Abbey that had crowned monarch for nearly 1,000 years that as the carriages turned onto Whitehall, the grandeur of the procession reached new heights. The wide boulevard, lined with military regiments in full ceremonial dress, looked like a living painting. The scarlet uniforms of the guards shimmered beneath the autumn sun, their polished boots striking the cobblestones in flawless unison. Brass instruments gleamed, drums thundered, and every note carried a weight of tradition that seemed to echo through centuries. Crowds leaned over barriers, some waving flags so vigorously their arms shook, others simply clasping their hands together in prayerful silence. One boy, perched on his father's shoulders, shouted, "God save the King!" His small voice was soon drowned out by a wave of cheers, as if the crowd itself had found new breath. From within the carriage, William could hear the swell of voices, the mixture of music, bells, and cheers becoming a single, powerful sound. He turned his head slightly, taking it all in, the banners, the faces, the sheer magnitude of a city united in one moment. He wasn't just traveling to Westminster Abbey. He was being carried there by the will and faith of the people. Kate, too, felt the emotional pull. At one corner, she spotted a group of nurses in uniform, their faces lit with pride as they waved together. On another stretch, an elderly veteran saluted smartly as the carriage passed. Each encounter seemed to tell its own story, a reminder that the monarchy was more than crowns and ceremony. It was about people, memory, and belonging. In the children's carriage, George leaned closer to the window, identifying historic buildings along the way. "That's the cenotaph," he whispered, his voice carrying both reverence and pride. Charlotte nodded, absorbing every word, while Louis, unable to contain himself, tapped excitedly on the glass whenever the crowd roared. The Abbey was drawing closer. Each note from the military bands, each toll of the church bells, was like a heartbeat leading them to the threshold of history. The carriages turned toward Parliament Square, and suddenly the roar of the crowd seemed to double. The air was electric, a blend of excitement, reverence, and celebration. Flags rippled in the breeze, and flower petals rained down from balconies where families leaned out to catch a glimpse of history in motion. UT to begin. Westminster Abbey now loomed ahead, majestic, timeless, almost otherworldly. Its Gothic towers stretched into the sky, silhouetted against the golden morning light. For nearly a millennium, this sacred place had witnessed coronations, weddings, funerals, and state ceremonies. Today, it would bear witness to a new chapter in the monarchy's story. Inside their carriage, William sat straighter, his eyes locked on the Abbey. His heart quickened, not from nerves alone, but from the knowledge of what awaited him. In a matter of minutes, he would step into the footsteps of kings and queens stretching back to William the Conqueror. The continuity of history pressed heavily on him, yet there was also strength in it, a sense that he was part of something enduring. Kate's gaze softened as she watched the Abbey draw closer. She knew her role today was more than symbolic. It was the beginning of her life as Queen Consort, a partner in William's reign. Her thoughts drifted briefly to her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, whose wide-eyed faces reflected the awe of the moment. They were not just observers. They were witnesses to the shaping of their family's destiny. The children's carriage slowed, and Charlotte gasped, her small hands gripping the window frame. "It's beautiful," she whispered. George, ever composed, nodded gravely, though his eyes betrayed the wonder he felt. Even Louis, usually restless, fell into hushed silence as the Abbey's ancient walls came into full view. The carriages finally drew to a halt. The air seemed to hold its breath. Guards snapped to attention, bands quieted, and the thunderous cheers softened into an expectant hush. The time had come for the royal family to step into the heart of history. The golden carriages slowed to their final stop before the grand west doors of Westminster Abbey. The horses stilled, their breath rising in pale clouds, as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. The music of the bands faded, replaced by the sound of church bells echoing across London, a solemn yet triumphant announcement that the coronation was about to begin. Crowds pressed against the barriers, their cheers rising once more, but this time with reverence. People craned their necks, phones lifted high, desperate to capture even a glimpse of the family's arrival. The Abbey itself seemed alive, its ancient stones glowing in the morning light, its stained-glass windows catching sparks of color like jewels. The door of the first carriage opened, and William stepped out. The sunlight struck his uniform, igniting the gold braiding into brilliance. He paused only for a second, drawing a deep breath before turning to offer his hand to Kate. She emerged gracefully, her ivory gown flowing behind her like liquid light, the diamonds of her tiara scattering glimmers across the stone. Together, they moved toward the Abbey steps, a portrait of unity, duty, and quiet strength. From the second carriage, George climbed down first, standing with a composure far beyond his years. Charlotte followed, her pink dress fluttering softly in the breeze as she clutched her mother's hand. Last came Louis, his small fingers gripping tightly to his toy horse, a childlike reminder that even amid the grandeur of kingship, innocence still had its place. Trumpets sounded, their clear notes soaring above the hushed crowd. Guards lined the steps in perfect formation, their scarlet uniforms and gleaming helmets forming a living corridor of honor. Inside, the Abbey awaited, its ancient stones ready to echo with sacred vows and history's timeless rituals. William glanced once more at Kate and their children, his eyes steady but filled with emotion. Then, with the weight of the crown just moments away, he led his family toward the great doors. The coronation was Abo. She stepped forward with graceful composure, though her heart raced. A smaller but equally dazzling crown, Queen Mary's crown, carefully adapted for this day, was lifted and gently placed upon her head. The jewels caught the Abbey's light in 1,000 sparks, but it wasn't the gems that held the congregation's attention. It was Kate herself, her calm dignity, her steady gaze, her quiet strength, all told the world that she was ready. As she rose and stood beside William, the symbolism was unmistakable. Husband and wife, king and queen, partners in life, now partners in destiny. Their hands brushed briefly, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes in its intimacy. It was a reminder that behind all the tradition and ceremony, this was still a love story, one that had grown, endured, and now stepped into history. The children looked on in awe. For Charlotte, especially, it was a moment of wonder, her mother transformed before her eyes into a queen. George sat upright, the future king watching the present unfold, his young shoulders already sensing the weight of what it would one day mean for him. Even Louis, restless as ever, seemed to pause in recognition of the grandeur. The enthronement followed. William was seated upon the ancient coronation chair, carved from oak, scarred by centuries, and yet revered beyond measure. Kate took her place beside him, her throne a testament to partnership, not subservience. Together, they looked out over the Abbey, and the world looked back. Representatives from across the globe stepped forward to pay homage, their words blending into a tapestry of respect and allegiance. The moment was both ancient and new, binding together the past and the present in a way only a coronation could. Finally, as Handel Zadok the priest swelled through the Abbey, the ceremony reached its crescendo. William and Kate were no longer simply prince and princess, nor merely husband and wife. They were king and queen, guardians of a tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. The Abbey's bells rang, and history echoed in every corner. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was unlike anything outside. The air was hushed, reverent, heavy with centuries of memory. Sunlight streamed through stained-glass windows, painting the ancient stone walls with colors as rich as a history they had witnessed. Every corner of the Abbey seemed alive with anticipation. This was not just a ceremony. It was a continuation of a 1,000-year story. Religious leaders from across faiths had gathered, a living testament to the monarchy's commitment to a diverse and modern Britain. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the center, his voice steady, ready to guide the ceremony that would transform a prince into a king. The Abbey doors opened, and all rose as William and Kate entered. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the congregation. Foreign royals, world leaders, British dignitaries, and ordinary citizens who had been chosen to attend. Each pair of eyes was fixed on the couple who now carried the hopes of a nation. William walked with deliberate steps, his uniform gleaming under the Abbey's light. Beside him, Kate glided with quiet grace, her gown trailing across the same stone floor that had felt the footsteps of monarchs for nearly a millennium. Their children followed, George walking with poised solemnity, Charlotte nearly glowing with excitement, and Louis looking around with wide-eyed awe. As they reached the altar, the Archbishop raised his voice to begin the recognition, an ancient moment where William was presented to the people as their rightful sovereign. The congregation responded with a thunderous, "God save the King!" The sound reverberated through the Abbey's soaring arches, shaking even the most seasoned royal watchers with its force. Kate's eyes glistened as she looked at William, not just as a husband, but as a man who was stepping into his destiny. Their children sat in the front row, captivated, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity of what was happening, but sensing that they were part of something monumental. The coronation had begun. The Abbey fell into silence as William stepped forward to take the oath of service. His voice rang clear beneath the vaulted ceilings, every syllable deliberate, every promise binding. He vowed to uphold the law, to serve his people with justice and mercy, and to preserve the traditions of the monarchy while guiding Britain into a modern age. These were words spoken by monarchs for centuries, yet in that moment they felt deeply personal, tailored to the man who now spoke them. Kate's gaze never left him. She had seen William in countless roles, soldier, father, husband, but this was different. Today, he wasn't just a man she loved. He was a sovereign pledging himself to his people. Her pride was unmistakable, but so was the emotion welling in her eyes. Then came the most sacred moment, the anointing. A golden canopy was carried over William, shielding him from public view, for this was an act meant for God alone. The Archbishop dipped his fingers into consecrated oil from the Mount of Olives and anointed William's hands, chest, and head. For centuries, this ritual had marked the spiritual transformation of a monarch, turning kingship from a title into a sacred calling. Beneath the canopy, William bowed his head. Though the congregation could not see his face, they felt the shift in the air, the quiet, invisible moment when a prince became a king in spirit. When the canopy was lifted, William seemed changed. The same man, yes, but with something new in his presence, a solemn weight that now rested visibly on his shoulders. The congregation stayed, sensing the transformation as much as seeing it. In the front row, George sat up straighter, as though understanding instinctively that his father had just crossed an invisible threshold. Charlotte's hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes wide with wonder. Louis, still young enough to fidget, waved briefly at a familiar face across the aisle, drawing smiles even in this solemn moment. The Abbey was hushed again, waiting for what would come next. The investiture, the robing, and finally, the crown. The hush deepened as attendants stepped forward carrying the ceremonial robes of kingship. Piece by piece, they were draped across William's shoulders, garments rich with history, each one embroidered with symbols of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The golden mantle shimmered in the candlelight, not just as fabric, but as a cloak of responsibility. The Archbishop's voice carried solemn authority as he explained each garment's meaning: justice, wisdom, mercy, and faith. William stood motionless, yet his presence seemed to grow with every layer. It was as though the Abbey itself was preparing him, clothing him not only in tradition, but in expectation. And then, the moment that had drawn the eyes of the world. St. Edward's crown was lifted from its resting place. Solid gold, heavy with jewels, it gleamed under the Abbey's light like the very embodiment of monarchy. The Archbishop raised it high, and for a moment there was complete silence. The crown descended slowly, carefully, until at last it touched William's head. The instant it settled into place, the Abbey erupted. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and a great shout of "God save the King!" surged from the congregation. Outside, church bells across London began to peal, their echoes spreading across Britain and far beyond, as if the whole Commonwealth was singing in unison. Kate's breath caught as she watched. It wasn't just ceremonial, it was transformative. The man she had married was still there, but now he bore the weight of 1,000 years of kingship. Pride welled within her, along with something more intimate, or at the courage it took to accept such a destiny. The children were transfixed. George's young face glowed with solemn understanding. He knew what this crown meant, and one day it would be his turn. Charlotte clasped her hands together, almost reverent, while Louis, wide-eyed, whispered something only his siblings could hear, drawing a small, nervous smile from Charlotte. The Abbey shook with sound, but at the center, William remained still. Crowned, yet humble, the echoes of the congregation's cries still lingered when the Archbishop turned to Kate. Now, it was her moment, the transition from Duchess and Princess of Wales to Queen Consort. At the foot of the Abbey steps, the gold state coach stood waiting, a gleaming relic of the past, its panels painted with mythological scenes, its gilded carvings glittering in the midday sun. For centuries, it had carried monarchs after their coronations, and today it was ready once again. 8 Windsor grey horses, calm and regal, pawed the ground as if eager to lead the family home. William guided Kate carefully into the coach, his hand steady as he lifted the train of her gown to protect its delicate embroidery. She offered him a grateful smile, the kind that spoke not only of love, but of partnership in every detail. Once they were settled inside, the children climbed into their own carriage, now brimming with chatter and excitement. The moment the coaches began to roll, the crowds erupted. It wasn't just cheering anymore, it was celebration. London streets had transformed into a festival. Union Jacks waved from every corner, street vendors sold commemorative flags, and musicians struck up impromptu tunes to add to the revelry. It felt less like formality and more like a shared victory, a day etched into memory for all. Inside the golden coach, William and Kate exchanged quiet words, their hands brushing occasionally as they waved to the crowds. From her window, Kate spotted families pressed close together, grandparents explaining the day to grandchildren, parents lifting toddlers onto their shoulders. These were the scenes that moved her most, moments where the monarchy became not just ceremony, but family connecting with family. In the children's carriage, Charlotte waved tirelessly, her small hand darting side to side as the crowd responded with delighted cheers. Louis clapped each time the music of a marching band swelled, convinced the fanfare was for him alone. George, ever the little statesman, maintained his posture, but the faint smile tugging at his lips betrayed the pride he felt in his father. As the coaches turned down the Mall, the iconic view of Buckingham Palace came into sight. The final stage of this extraordinary day was about to unfold. The palace gates opened with ceremonial precision, guardsmen in scarlet uniforms lining the entrance as the royal coaches rolled into the forecourt. Above, the Union Jack billowed proudly, a signal that the sovereign were home. The cheering outside was deafening, yet inside the courtyard there was a brief, reverent calm. William stepped down first, immediately turning to help Kate from the gold state coach. The simple act, his hand steadying hers as she adjusted the heavy train of her gown, was caught by cameras worldwide. It was a gesture both intimate and symbolic, a king and queen, but still husband and wife, supporting one another. The children followed, greeted warmly by palace staff who had known them since their earliest days. For many of these attendants, this was not just an official duty but a deeply personal moment. The young family they had helped nurture now stepping fully into history. Smiles, nods, and whispered words of congratulations passed quietly between staff and royals before the family disappeared inside. In the palace's private rooms, the atmosphere shifted. At last, the weight of public spectacle gave way to relief and laughter. George carefully adjusted his miniature uniform. Charlotte chatted eagerly about the waving crowds, and Louis, clutching his ever-faithful toy horse, asked if the bells outside were still ringing for Daddy. Kate knelt beside him, smoothing his hair, her eyes soft with maternal pride. For William, these few private moments were priceless. Away from the Abbey's grandeur and the roar of the crowd, he could simply be a father, sharing smiles and quiet reassurances with his children. Yet even here, the magnitude of the day was never far from mind. In just minutes, they would step back out, not into carriages this time, but onto the balcony that symbolized the monarchy's bond with its people. As a family gathered, ready to present themselves to the waiting nation, the palace staff gave the final signal. The doors to the balcony were about to open. The great doors of Buckingham Palace's balcony opened, and the roar that followed was unlike anything heard that day. It was not just sound. It was a tidal wave of emotion, a nation pouring its heart into one single moment. Flags fluttered, voices rose, and the vast crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, united beneath the London sky. William stepped out first, the imperial state crown gleaming brilliantly in the afternoon sun. Kate followed at his side, radiant in Queen Mary's crown, her ivory gown glistening with every step. For a heartbeat, they paused together, framed by the palace's grand columns, before lifting their hands to wave. The response was immediate, an eruption of cheers, applause, and tears. Then came the children. George stood tall, mirroring his father's posture with remarkable composure. Charlotte waved enthusiastically, her delight infectious as the crowd roared in return. And Louis, ever the spirited youngest, clapped and pointed at the sky as the sound of aircraft engines rumbled overhead. Right on cue, the Royal Air Force flew past in tight formation, streaks of red, white, and blue smoke trailing against the blue canvas of the sky. The crowd gasped, then cheered even louder, as though the heavens themselves were blessing the new reign. On the balcony, William and Kate leaned subtly toward one another. Their hands brushed, a quiet reminder of the bond that had carried them through this extraordinary journey. In that small gesture was everything: love, duty, partnership, and the promise of a shared future. For the people gathered below, and the millions watching worldwide, this was not just a royal tradition. It was a renewal, a story that began centuries ago, now carried forward by a new generation. As the fly-past faded and the cheers rolled on, William and Kate looked out over their kingdom. The weight of the crown was heavy, but the support of the people was stronger still. And in that moment, as the sun set over London, a new chapter of the monarchy truly began.